We challenged ourselves to stop thinking primarily in terms of programs and start thinking in terms of steps. But once we've identified the steps, we have another problem. How do we actually make them work? Because good intentions are not a plan. And simply copying what another church is doing is not a plan either. So this session, we're going to talk about something that may sound very ordinary, planning the work. Before we plan a ministry, we need to know what we're trying to accomplish. So let's start with the biggest question. What is Jesus calling us to do? Despite what might be on our wall, what is the mission of our ministry? And just as importantly, what is outside of our scope? Every ministry has limits. We can't do everything. So we need to define our scope. What are we trying to accomplish? And what are we not trying to accomplish? What assumptions are we making? And what does success actually look like? If we don't answer those questions first, we can spend enormous amounts of time and energy doing things that may be good, but aren't necessarily part of the mission God has given us. Once we understand the mission and scope, we can identify the deliverables. In simple terms, what are we actually going to produce or accomplish? And these need to be specific enough that we can tell whether they have happened. This takes us back to the previous principle. We've identified the steps people need to take. Now we need to define those steps clearly. Which steps do we do now? Which steps need to come later as our resources grow? What does each step need to achieve? And what will we need to make each step work? Then we can design, develop, and then test each step. Don't simply launch it because it sounds like a good idea. Build it, try it, watch what happens, listen to feedback, measure, and improve it. But there is another critical part of planning. We need to know who we are trying to reach in each step. And how well do we actually understand them? We need to understand their culture, how they use technology, what is their normal moral framework, how do they form relationships, what do they believe, what assumptions do they have about Christianity. And perhaps one of the biggest questions facing Christian leaders today is this: how do we communicate eternal truth effectively in a culture whose attention, worldview, relationships, and assumptions are radically different from those of previous generations? The answer isn't to change the truth. The message doesn't change. But the messenger must understand the people to whom he is speaking. The Apostle Paul understood this principle. He didn't change the gospel, but he understood the people he was speaking to, their culture, their beliefs, and their questions. So when we design our steps, we need to ask, who is this for? What do they understand? What don't they understand? And what barriers might prevent them from taking this step? And how can we communicate the truth in a way they can actually hear? We will discuss this in more detail in Principle 4, Teach Less for More. And then comes a question that many ministries don't ask often enough. How are we going to measure success? If we say we want to make disciples, what does that actually look like? If we want visitors to become connected, how will we know? If we want believers to grow, what evidence will we look for? If we want mature believers to become disciple makers, how will we know that is happening? Attendance might be one measurement, but that alone isn't fruit. We need to identify the indicators that actually tell us whether each step is achieving its purpose. Plan the work before you measure it, but also decide how you will measure it before you launch it. Let's look at two examples. These aren't prescriptions for every church, but examples of the kind of thinking I'm talking about. So the point is not every church should do this. The point is, Think carefully about what you're trying to achieve and then design the environment around that objective. So the first scenario, which will apply especially for a church with its own building. Imagine a church that has its own building and wants its Sunday gathering to be a genuine entry point for visitors. Then let's plan around that objective. The Sunday service could be deliberately designed for visitors, while also providing an excellent environment for children. How long can we reasonably expect a visitor to be engaged? So perhaps the service has a strict time, say 60 and 90 minutes maximum. The hosting team is trained to make people feel genuinely welcome without becoming overbearing. Rather than an extended worship set, perhaps there are 3 or 4 songs. Mature believers could be trained to share 2 or 3 short testimonies as part of the worship. Why? Because visitors don't simply hear somebody singing about what God has done. They hear evidence of Scripture being applied to real lives. We might decide not to take a money offering in that environment. Why would we? Because if our primary objective is to welcome outsiders, we don't want a new visitor to feel that they have entered a membership meeting where they are immediately expected to contribute financially. The teaching could focus on foundational topics: the gospel, how to pray, how to read the Bible, managing money, parenting, marriage, and other subjects that help people understand how Christian faith applies to life. And the children's environment should not simply be an afterthought. It needs to be engaging, age-appropriate, and designed specifically for children. Approaches using theater and strong storytelling can be particularly effective. And what about the regular believers? They come expecting to serve, not simply to be served. They welcome, they help, they share, they disciple, they create the environment for others. And we need some non-obtrusive way of establishing a connection with people who attend so that we can follow up and understand whether people are returning and moving forward. Again, the point isn't that this is the correct Sunday service. The point is the objective drives the design. In this scenario, let's consider community groups. If the Sunday service is designed for visitors, imagine the community groups are designed primarily for regular attendees. Perhaps groups are kept relatively small, around 12 people. There is a trained leader who guides the meeting and facilitates the teaching. They can meet in homes or at the church. This is the appropriate environment where communion takes place. Giving announcements and other internal church business can happen here rather than taking up valuable time in the visitor-focused Sunday environment. And groups can be designed around particular needs. Perhaps some are organized by age or gender. Perhaps a foundational group is created for new believers and a group for youth until a youth environment is developed later as the ministry grows. Again, start with the objective, then design the step. What about other needs? And what about something like elderly care? We should certainly care about elderly people, but as leaders we should ask, does this belong within our primary mission and scope? Or is it becoming sideways energy that takes resources away from the primary objective? Perhaps there's an important need that we can help address without taking on an entire new project. That is what scope is about. Not everything that is good belongs in our plan. Let's look at a second scenario, one that might work well for a church without its own building. Perhaps you don't have your own building and hire a facility for Sunday meetings. The plan might look completely different to scenario 1. Perhaps this Sunday service is designed primarily for regular attendees and believers. There may be minimal setup. It can feel more like going to visit family. The time doesn't necessarily need to be as tightly controlled. The teaching can be more substantial. Communion can be part of the gathering. Money matters and church announcements can be discussed. And again, there should be an engaging environment for children. This environment could be shaped more like a teaching and training environment because discipleship is a primary objective. Then the community groups can serve a different purpose. They can have a strong bring a friend emphasis, a relaxed social environment, maybe with a meal or some food, but with a trained leader, and an environment where someone who isn't a Christian can come completely into a comfortable home, meeting people and begin exploring Christianity. You could even use a 6-week course around something immediately relevant to people's lives, like parenting, or marriage, or relationships, or another genuine need, and use that as a bridge into deeper conversations about faith. Again, there isn't one formula. The environment follows the objective. Now, you may disagree with some of these ideas, and that's fine. I'm not suggesting that every church should adopt either one of these models. I'm trying to demonstrate a different way of thinking. We shouldn't simply do what everybody else is doing because that's what churches do. We should ask, what has Jesus called us to do? Who are we trying to reach? What steps do people need to take? What is each environment designed to accomplish? What resources will we need? And how will we know whether it's working? Planning doesn't guarantee success, but failing to plan makes it much harder to know whether we're succeeding or simply keeping busy. So take your ministry and work through it. Clarify your mission, define your scope, identify the steps, define the deliverables, understand your audience. Design each step, then test it, measure it, and then improve it. And perhaps, above everything else, keep asking the question, what is Jesus calling us to do? Because our goal isn't to build the most impressive program. Our goal isn't to copy the church down the road. Our goal isn't even to keep everybody happy. And it certainly isn't just about the numbers. Our goal is to be faithful to what Jesus has called us to do and to produce the fruit he desires. In the next session, we'll look at what happens once we've identified the right plan. How do we cast that vision convincingly enough that people understand it, believe in it, and are willing to commit their time, gifts, and resources to make it happen?